All right. I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge some of our dignitaries that we have here with us. We have Councillor Frank Breen, we have Councillor Linda Kelly, who is in fact a founding member of Labor for Refugees. We have the Honourable Meredith Bergman, and also Penny Sharp, Helen Westwood and Jeanette McHugh will also be joining us. So thank you to all of those people for being here, and for anybody else who I might have missed in the enormous crowd. Thank you for coming to listen to Julian Burnside launch The Drowning's Argument. This is a book that has been edited by Rodney Rothfield for Labor for Refugees. Now, there may be many in the room who don't actually know who Labor for Refugees are. We're an active group of Labor Party members and trade unionists who are seeking for just and fair Labor Party policy on refugees and asylum seekers. And this is a particularly big year for us because it's the National Party Conference in July. So forums such as this are very important in terms of our momentum towards building towards a better position at the National Conference in July. So thank you for being here. I was reminded by Nizza that we do want to get your details, so please sign the attendance sheet, and particularly if you're if you're interested in being involved with Labor for Refugees, please sign up at the end of the meeting and come and talk to some of the volunteers and representatives of Labor for Refugees here. My personal journey about one of the reasons I wanted to get so much involved in this issue was that when I was working for the Public Education Foundation, one of the scholarships we ran was a scholarship called the Friends of Zainab Scholarship. And I don't know, but there would be some people in this room who've heard of this scholarship. It was started at first by the absolutely wonderful Dorothy Hodnott out at Holwood High in southwestern Sydney. And it was a scholarship that supported refugee students in years 11 and 12 in order for them to get through high school, and then we often supported them on into their university years as well. And it was through this scholarship that I met so many amazing young people whose stories you could not believe if you weren't hearing them with your own ears. So the one I always remember is Nahid Karimi. So Nahid Karimi, she was a young Afghan woman. She arrived in Australia in September 2001. You can imagine that timing. And she and her family were put into Port Hedland for 8 months before moving to Sydney on temporary protection visas. When she rocked up, aged 13, at Holroyd High School, it was the first formal education experience she had ever had in her life. So before that, she had been homeschooled by her mother in Afghanistan, but she'd never attended a formal school. She knew no English. So you arrived at this big, massive high school in Western Sydney, and this is your first ever experience, and you know no English. Now, Nahid went through the Intensive English Centre. She studied away. She was supported all the time by the amazing teachers out there, supported by the Friends of Zainab Scholarship, and she ended up, within just 5 years, finishing her HSC and matriculating to a Bachelor of Medical Sciences at the University of Western Sydney. You know, and she's not the only one. I mean, you know, Bari Marty, who was this young man who's similar sort of thing. And when he rocked up to go to UWS on the first day, because he was still on a temporary protection visa, they said, "Oh, you're an international student, you'll have to pay $100,000 please." So, anyway, point being that you had to pay $100,000 for the degree. That was sorted out immediately again by Dorothy mucking around and getting UWS to give him a scholarship. But it is simply ridiculous. It is simply ridiculous. And these are the people who make it through the system. These are the people who actually are lucky enough to reach our shores and then to get the helping hands of all the people who care so much about their future. What happens to the rest of them? So this really, I mean, I don't need to tell this room this, but when Italy experienced the massive deaths of asylum seekers at sea in 2013, when they lost 368 Eritreans and 232 Syrians, drowned in 2 separate incidents, there was a massive public outcry. And how did the Italian government respond? They responded with a new rescue policy. They put in a flotilla of 5 Navy vessels, crewed by more than 850 Navy officers, and have since then since just 2013, they've saved 10,000 people, including over 600 women and more than 1,000 children. Now, when Australia witnessed a similar sort of tragedy at the shores of Christmas Island, our response was very different. There was no grand rescue strategy. In fact, it was the exact opposite. In fact, all there was a commitment to tougher punitive measures. And it really makes you wonder about the Australian psyche. Like, what is wrong with us? Why is our collective capacity for empathy so bruised? You know, I think it's Pope Francis who says, in a world of globalisation, we have fallen into a globalisation of indifference, making us insensitive to the cries of others. But the thing that you really think when you think about that Christmas Island experience is that people were appalled. Like, I remember it, people were appalled and they were upset by the images. There was a whole lot of public outcry. But what was different was our political response to the public outcry. It's what our leaders said in response to that outcry. And rather than our politicians speaking to people's better angels and using this crisis as an opportunity to gain popular support for more humane refugee practices, which it could have been a galvanising experience, they once again fell into the tried and tested formula of blaming the victims of the tragedy. These were bad refugees. These were refugees who were trying to skip the queue. These were refugees who were so terrible that they callously risked the lives of their children. Now, I was on the far north coast of New South Wales in 2001. I was running the Labor Party election campaign up there and things were looking good. Labor was going well. We were going to storm back into government and win the November election. And then two things occurred. In September, the World Trade Centre was attacked. And then a little bit later, the Tampa sailed into Australian waters. And in an instant, our world changed fundamentally. And it was interesting for me, having come from the inner city of Sydney, because I'll never forget the flood of phone calls coming into the campaign office up in the Tweed Heads, and especially once Tampa was around. The mix of both the World Trade Centre attacks and the Tampa had most of Tweed Heads convinced that the Arabs were about to arrive on our shores. You know, it was just this totally fearful reaction of people on the phone. And we all know that Howard exploited that Tampa incident mercilessly. I mean, I'll never forget driving around the booth on the day of that election, and everyone voted early and they were silent. It was almost as if they felt guilty about what they were about to do. So you'd see all these working class people who worked their whole lives standing in the queue silent next to the giant posters of "We may say who comes into our country and what," the conditions, circumstances under which they came. And I will always blame John Howard for this immoral playing of the race card, because I think it has affected our politics forevermore. And his decision around the Tampa spelt the end of the bipartisan political consensus that had actually existed in Australian politics, especially since the Vietnam War. So when you remember the 80,000 Vietnamese who immigrated to Australia immediately after the Vietnam War, the Fraser government welcomed them, and the Labor opposition welcomed them in a bipartisan consensus. There was no baiting, there was no playing of the race card, there was no playing to people's worser natures. And Howard ended that political consensus, but to the Labor Party's eternal shame, we decided to follow him. It's like we followed him into the abyss. And the absolute kindest interpretation that I can give to our leaders at the time was that they were sensed they were so close to victory that, okay, we'll just follow this and then when we get in we can fix it up. But of course that didn't happen. We didn't win. Our moral authority evaporated, and Australian politics around refugees and asylum seekers entered over a decade of tit for tat and who can best stop the boats sort of politics. And ever since then we've been going downhill. So what do we do now? What can Labor Party politicians do? What can the Labor Party do? What can the community do? Well, as far as the Labor Party is concerned, I believe always that we must be a party of conviction and base our decisions on evidence. And the evidence is clear. We do not have a refugee crisis on our borders. You know, Australia hosts about 1/10 of 1% of the world's refugees. right? 1/10 of 1%. This is not much for a country with some of the lowest population densities and in fact the world's 13th largest economy. We're simply not doing it. The Labor Party should follow the law. We should follow international law. We should take pride. We should take pride in the fact that the Australian Labor Party played a very significant role in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Doc Evatt, and we should own that history. We should own that history and always seek to uphold and promote the law of international human rights. Labor must return to the moral fray and ensure that our policy regarding refugees is in accordance with our country's legal obligations. No ifs, no buts. But what then? What then? How do we then restore bipartisan consensus? How do we stop the Scott Morrisons and the Tony Abbotts from running around the country's marginal seats telling people that the refugees are coming to their doors? And that's, I think, where you come in. That's where organisations like Labour for Refugees and all the people in the room here come in. We need to demand humane refugee policies from all sides of politics. We need to build broad alliances with everyone we can find, you know, with church groups, with civil society, with the traditional media, with social media, in the schools, in the pubs, in the workplaces, in the unions, you know, in the universities. We need to stretch out to the good members in the coalition party on this issue. The aim must be, has to be, to restore consensus, to restore bipartisan consensus on the issue of human rights for asylum seekers. There is so much political goodwill from everyone here today, so much potential to do this. And Labour for Refugees, I just wanted to salute everyone who are the activists who do this work because it's just one part of the puzzle, but it's such an important part of that puzzle.